In the quaint village of Somber Hollow, Easter was not marked by the cheerful hunt for eggs or the playful giggle of children. Here the air hung heavy with mist and the whispers of the past, stories told in hushed tones over flickering candlelight. The legend of Clawfoot Jack, the monstrous rabbit, overshadowed every Easter celebration, turning what should be a festival of rebirth and joy into a time of caution and fear. Emmy, David, and Sergio were the best of friends, bound together not just by their youth, but by a shared thrill for the forbidden and the macabre. They grew up on tales of Clawfoot Jack, a giant rabbit whose fur was as white as the full moon and whose teeth were stained with the blood of the unwary. It was said that on every Easter Eve, he emerged from his underground lair, prowling for the careless souls who dared to wander alone at night. The friends, fueled by a cocktail of adolescence and adrenaline, decided this Easter would be different. They would not cower. Instead, they would seek out the lair of Clawfoot Jack. They planned to steal his collection of blood-stained Easter eggs, trophies from his victims, to prove once and for all whether the legend was real. "Think about it," Sergio had said, his eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and fear. "No one's ever dared to do it. We'll be legends." "Yeah, or dead," David had replied, half joking, half serious. But his reservations were drowned out by the allure of the adventure. Under the light of the moon, the trio set out, equipped with nothing but a flashlight, a map they had pieced together from old village tales, and an unspoken bond of bravery. They trekked through the eerie woods that skirted Somber Hollow, where the trees whispered secrets in the chill wind. After what seemed like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. The ground was oddly barren, the grass around it scorched as if avoiding something foul beneath. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its trunk wide and gnarled, the entrance of a burrow lying ominously at its roots. The burrow was unusually large enough for a person to crawl into, and as the flashlight beam hit its edges, they spotted traces of dried blood. "This has to be it," Emmy whispered, his voice barely hiding his nervous excitement. "Clawfoot Jack's lair." Without a word, they began their descent into the darkness, the air growing colder as they moved deeper underground. The tunnel was lined with roots that felt like cold fingers brushing against them. Suddenly, David's foot hit something hard. They pointed the flashlight down and froze. A human skull stared back at them, its hollow eyes a silent scream in the abyss. Panic surged, but their curiosity pushed them forward until they reached an expansive underground chamber. It was a horrific sight. The walls were adorned with bones, and in the center, a pile of giant Easter eggs, each splattered with crimson. Before they could retreat, a chilling sound echoed through the chamber, a guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They turned slowly, the beam of their flashlight trembling as it settled on the monstrous figure of Clawfoot Jack. His fur was matted with blood, his eyes a reflective red, and his mouth twisted in a grotesque grin as if amused by their terror. "You've come for my treasures?" His voice was a rasp, a sound like knives on bone. "Then you shall join them." The beast lunged, quicker than anything its size should be, and the boys scattered. Emmy and Sergio managed to dodge, but David was not so lucky. The creature grabbed him, its claws piercing through his jacket as it dragged him back. Emmy and Sergio, horrified, watched as David struggled. But then, amidst the chaos, they saw something, a glint of metal among the bones. A weapon, perhaps their only chance, as the monstrous rabbit threw David into a bone-lined pit, promising a slow and terrifying end. Emmy and Sergio made a decision that would either save them all or doom them to a fate worse than death. They dived towards the weapon, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm of hope and dread. Clawfoot Jack turned to face them, his gruesome mouth open in a snarl, the Easter moon casting long shadows over the scene of impending doom. With hearts pounding and breaths held in suspense, Emmy and Sergio scrambled across the bone-strewn floor of the underground chamber. Their hands finally clasped the cold metal object they had spied, a rusted ancient hatchet embedded in the skull of some long-forgotten victim of Clawfoot Jack. The weapon felt heavy, imbued with the terror and desperation of all who had fallen before them. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful dirge through the trees of Somber Hollow, as if nature itself mourned the folly of the young boys. Underground, however, the sound was muffled to a whisper, replaced by the sinister drip of water echoing through the chamber like the ticking of a clock counting down their final moments. Clawfoot Jack, his monstrous form hulking in the dim light, advanced with a predatory grace, his eyes glinting with malice and amusement. "Foolish boys," he growled, "you've brought yourselves to the slaughter." "David, hang on," Emmy shouted, gripping the hatchet with trembling hands. He and Sergiu positioned themselves between David, who was struggling to climb out of the pit, and the advancing nightmare. "Remember the plan," Sergiu whispered to Emmy, his voice a shaky thread of resolve. They had discussed it briefly, a desperate strategy formed in moments of adrenaline-fueled clarity. Distract the beast, rescue David, and escape. Simple to conceive, yet monstrous to execute. As Clawfoot Jack lunged forward, Emmy swung the hatchet with all his might, aiming for the creature's leg. The blade struck true, embedding itself in the thick, sinewy thigh of the rabbit. A horrifying scream tore from the beast's throat, a sound that mixed human agony with animalistic rage. Blood, dark and oozing, stained its white fur. Seizing the moment of the beast's pain, Sergiu dashed to the pit, extending his hand to David. "Come on," he urged desperately. David reached up, his fingers brushing against Sergiu's, when suddenly a massive, clawed hand grasped his ankle, yanking him back down with inhuman force. "No!" Sergiu cried out, his voice breaking as he watched his friend disappear into the darkness of the pit. Emmy, meanwhile, dodged a swipe from Clawfoot Jack's other claw, the movement so close he could feel the wind from it against his face. He retrieved the hatchet, pulling with all his strength, the blade slick with the creature's blood. "We're not leaving without David," he shouted, his voice echoing defiantly in the chamber. With a roar that shook the very earth beneath them, Clawfoot Jack regained his full, terrifying height. The wound on his leg bled profusely, but it only seemed to fuel his wrath. "Then you shall stay forever," he hissed, advancing again with renewed ferocity. Sergiu, heart pounding, glanced around desperately and noticed a narrow passage behind the pile of eggs. "This way," he yelled to Emmy. "It might lead out." But as he called out, Clawfoot Jack's attention shifted momentarily, giving Emmy a critical opening. Using the beast's momentary distraction, Emmy charged, feinting with the hatchet before rolling past the creature's side, grabbing Sergiu's arm as he passed. Together, they plunged into the dark passage, the light from their dropped flashlight casting long, sinister shadows that danced on the walls as they fled. Behind them, the enraged bellows of Clawfoot Jack filled the tunnels, a cacophony of rage that promised a hunt to the death. Ahead, the tunnel seemed to stretch into perpetual darkness, its end as uncertain as their fate. But even as they ran, their minds were tormented by the same thought. How could they leave David behind? With Clawfoot Jack wounded but undeterred, the race against death had only just begun. The narrow tunnel seemed to swallow Emmy and Sergiu whole as they fled deeper into its shadowy embrace. Their breaths echoed off the damp walls, mingling with the distant, enraged howls of Clawfoot Jack. Each step was a gamble, each turn a mystery unfolding into deeper darkness. The light from the chamber had long since faded, leaving only the oppressive blackness and the stifling, earthy smell of the underground. As they navigated the labyrinthine passageways, the sound of their own pounding hearts seemed deafening. Fear gripped them like a vice, but the thought of David, trapped or worse, drove them forward. "We need to go back for him," Emmy gasped, pausing to catch his breath against the cold wall. "We can't just leave him." Sergiu nodded, his face pale in the scant light. "I know. But first we need to find a way out, or a weapon, something more. We can't face that monster as we are." The tunnel eventually widened into a small cavern. The air was cooler here, and the faint glow of phosphorescent fungi cast a ghostly light. The walls were slick with moisture and covered in strange markings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The boys edged closer, curiosity piqued despite their fear. The markings were not random. They told a story, an ancient tale of a beast born from the earth's deepest womb. cursed by a pagan witch to guard a sacred site. "This must be ancient," Sergiu murmured, tracing the lines with his fingers. "Maybe it's about Jack." Their exploration was cut short by a soft, horrifying whimper that echoed through the cavern. It was a human sound, one filled with pain and fear. "David?" Emmy called tentatively, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. There was no response, only the sound repeated, leading them deeper into the next passageway. The boys followed, driven by a mix of hope and dread, their steps cautious as they moved toward the source. The tunnel narrowed again, and the air grew colder, heavier, as if it pressed against their chests with each breath. The whimpering grew louder, more desperate. They turned a bend and stumbled upon a shocking scene. A small chamber, lit by more phosphorescent light, where a figure was curled up on the ground. But it was not David. It was a girl, no older than themselves, her clothes torn and her body marked with scratches. "Who are you?" Emmy asked, stepping forward. The girl flinched, her eyes wide with terror. "It's okay. We're not going to hurt you." "I'm Lila," she stammered, her voice a fragile thread. "He took me days ago. I managed to escape, but I can't find the way out." "Clawfoot Jack?" Sergiu inquired, his voice low. She nodded, shivering. "We have to get out of here," Emmy said decisively. "All of us. We'll find David and then find a way out together." Their decision made, they helped Lila to her feet. She was weak but determined, fueled by the same desperate desire for freedom. As they prepared to move, a deep rolling growl resonated through the tunnel, chilling their blood. Clawfoot Jack was hunting, his monstrous rage echoing like thunder through the underground maze. The four of them moved as quietly as they could, the shadows seeming to loom and twist around them. Every sound was a potential threat, every whisper of wind a possible herald of doom. As they continued, the tunnels seemed to conspire against them, twisting and turning in maddening patterns. They stumbled upon remnants of previous victims, a grim reminder of what fate awaited them if caught. But amidst the horrors, they found something unexpected. An old, rusted pickaxe lodged in a pile of rubble. "This could be useful," Sergiu said, pulling it free. The weight of it in his hands felt like a promise, a small shard of hope in the suffocating darkness. Armed and renewed by a fragile hope, they pressed on, the echoes of their hunter's growls spurring them deeper into the heart of darkness, where ancient secrets lay buried, and the threat of death lurked in every shadow. The tunnels beneath Somber Hollow seemed endless, a labyrinth designed not merely to confuse but to terrify. With every turn, the oppressive weight of the earth above seemed to press closer, and the whispers of the past grew louder. Emmy, Sergiu, Lila, and the absence of David formed a silent pact of desperation, their shared fear uniting them as they pushed deeper into the abyss. As they progressed, the passageways became increasingly sinister. The walls were slick with something more than water. It was thick, viscous, and occasionally they would find it splattered with something that resembled dried blood. The light from the fungi grew sparser, casting grotesque shadows that danced and flickered with a life of their own. Suddenly Lila stopped, her breath hitching in a gasp. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The others listened intently. At first there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing and the distant, ever-present growls of Clawfoot Jack. But then a new sound emerged, a soft, scraping noise like something being dragged across stone. "It's coming from up ahead," Sergiu said, his grip tightening on the pickaxe. They exchanged glances, a wordless agreement passing between them. They needed to know if it was David or something else. Advancing with caution, they rounded another bend and were met with a sight that drained the color from their faces. A large chamber opened up before them, the center of which was dominated by a grotesque altar made of bones. Atop the altar lay a figure, still and pale, its chest barely rising and falling with shallow breaths. It was David, unconscious or worse, his body surrounded by a collection of those ghastly, blood-stained Easter eggs. And there, standing over him, was Clawfoot Jack, his fur matted and his monstrous claws slick with fresh blood. He was so engrossed in some dark ritual that he hadn't noticed their approach. "David!" Emmy breathed, a mix of relief and horror seizing him. Clawfoot Jack's head snapped towards them, his red eyes burning with a malevolent fire. With a snarl, he abandoned the ritual and moved with terrifying speed, charging towards them. "Run!" Sergiu shouted, pushing Lila behind him as he swung the pickaxe with all his might. The weapon connected with a sickening crunch against Clawfoot Jack's shoulder, causing the beast to stagger but not fall. Emmy darted towards the altar, sliding across the slick floor to reach David. He shook his friend, desperately trying to rouse him from his unconscious state. "David, come on, we have to get out of here," David groaned, his eyes fluttering open, confusion and pain warring in his gaze. "Emmy," he murmured, struggling to sit up. Meanwhile, Lila and Sergiu were locked in a deadly dance with Clawfoot Jack. Every strike from Sergiu was parried with a vicious swipe of the rabbit's claws. Lila, finding a shard of bone on the ground, joined in, stabbing at the beast's legs, trying to slow it down. The chamber echoed with the sounds of battle, cries of pain mingling with the beast's enraged roars. Above the fray, the dim light flickered ominously, casting all in a ghastly, pulsating glow that seemed to heartbeat with the rhythm of their terror. With David barely conscious but able to move, Emmy helped him to his feet. "We need to help them," David said weakly, gesturing towards where Sergiu and Lila fought desperately to hold the monster at bay. Together, they limped towards the battle, Emmy supporting David. They reached Sergiu just as he was knocked to the ground, his pickaxe flying from his grasp. Clawfoot Jack loomed over him, ready to deliver a fatal blow. With no time to think, Emmy grabbed the nearest egg from the altar, a heavy, grotesque thing, and hurled it with all his might at the beast's head. The egg smashed against Clawfoot Jack's skull, splattering him with its vile contents. The beast reeled, stunned by the unexpected assault, giving Sergiu the chance to scramble to his feet and retrieve his pickaxe. "Now!" Sergiu yelled, and together with Lila they launched a frenzied attack, driving the beast back with every strike. The battle raged, a desperate struggle for survival in the heart of darkness. As they fought, the walls of the chamber seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, the whispers of the dead growing louder, urging them on, desperate for vengeance against the monstrosity that had terrorized Somber Hollow for far too long. The battle in the underground chamber had reached a fever pitch. Clawfoot Jack, wounded and enraged by the assault, was a nightmare come to life, his every move driven by primal fury. The air was thick with the scent of blood and terror, each breath a reminder of the thin line between life and death. As Emmy, Sergiu, and Lila regrouped, preparing for another strike, a horrifying turn of events unfolded. Clawfoot Jack, with a sudden burst of demonic speed, bypassed Sergiu's defensive stance and seized David, who was still weak and staggering from his ordeal. "David!" Emmy screamed, lunging forward. But it was too late. With a grotesque smile, Clawfoot Jack lifted David high above the altar, his claws sinking deep into the flesh of his victim. David's agonized screams filled the chamber, a sound so harrowing it seemed to freeze the very air. "No!" Sergiu swung his pickaxe wildly, his eyes blurred with tears of rage and despair. Lila threw herself at the beast's legs, trying desperately to bring him down, but Clawfoot Jack was unstoppable in his wrath. With a swift, cruel motion, the monstrous rabbit brought David down onto the bone altar, and the terrible sound of tearing flesh echoed through the cavern. Emmy fell to his knees, his vision clouded by grief, his heart shattered by the sight of his friend being devoured before his very eyes. Clawfoot Jack's eyes gleamed with a sinister light as he consumed David, his body trembling with a vile satisfaction. The remaining friends were paralyzed with horror, their minds grappling with the brutal reality of their loss. It was Lila who recovered first, her voice a piercing cry that cut through the despair. "We can't let him win. For David." Her words struck a chord, reigniting the fire of vengeance within them. Sergiu, his face streaked with tears and blood, nodded grimly. He picked up the pickaxe, his hands shaking but his resolve steeling. "For David," he echoed, and with a defiant roar, he charged at Clawfoot Jack, swinging with all his might. The beast turned to meet Sergiu's attack, his own roars melding with the cries of battle. The chamber was a cacophony of violence, each clash of metal against bone resounding like a death knell. Emmy, overcome with grief, but fueled by the need to avenge his friend, found a jagged piece of bone on the ground. With a primal scream, he joined the fray, stabbing at the beast's sides, each thrust a testament to his pain and anger. Together, Emmy and Sergiu fought with a desperate, wild energy, pushing Clawfoot Jack back toward the wall of the chamber. Lila, finding a length of heavy chain on the floor, swung it around the beast's neck, pulling with all her might. The combined force of their attacks slowly began to turn the tide. Clawfoot Jack struggled against the onslaught, his movements becoming more erratic, his roars turning into gurgles as the chain tightened around his throat. His eyes, once filled with malevolent glee, now showed a flicker of fear. The chamber echoed with the sounds of their struggle, the walls seeming to shake with the intensity of their battle. Above them, the ceiling began to crumble, small stones falling as the very earth reacted to the ferocity of their fight. As Clawfoot Jack weakened, his grip on reality slipping, the friends pushed harder, driven by the memories of David, by the need to end the nightmare that had consumed their Easter. With one final concerted effort, Sergiu swung the pickaxe with all the strength he could muster, striking Clawfoot Jack directly in the heart. The beast let out a final guttural scream before collapsing onto the ground, his body convulsing before it lay still. Silence fell over the chamber, heavy and absolute, broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors. Emmy, Sergiu, and Lila stood over the fallen beast, their bodies trembling, their eyes reflecting the cost of their victory. As they gathered their strength, the reality of their loss sunk in deeper. David was gone, his sacrifice the dark price of their quest. But in his memory, they had found the strength to fight, to survive, and to conquer the darkness that had sought to consume them all. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of death, as Emmy and Sergiu, alongside Lila, stood motionless, staring at the lifeless form of Clawfoot Jack. The monster that had haunted their nightmares and devoured their friend lay defeated, a gruesome testament to their desperate struggle. The ground around them was a macabre tapestry of blood and bones, the remnants of their brutal confrontation. The silence was suffocating, each breath a reminder of the cost of their survival. Emmy's eyes were hollow, the spark of victory dulled by the overwhelming loss of David. He turned to look at the altar, where traces of his friend's existence had been cruelly erased, reduced to mere stains on the ancient stone. Sergiu, his body racked with silent sobs, dropped the pickaxe, the clang of metal on stone echoing like a somber bell through the chamber. He stumbled to the altar, placing a trembling hand on the cold surface, his fingers tracing the spots where David had last lain. "We did it, David," Sergiu whispered, his voice choked with grief. "But why does it feel like we lost?" Lila, her own face streaked with tears and dirt, moved closer to Emmy, her presence a silent offer of comfort. She had been a stranger to them before this nightmarish Easter, but now they were bound by a shared horror, a fellowship forged in the darkest depths of fear. "There's something we need to do," Emmy said suddenly, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. He pointed to the remnants of Clawfoot Jack's body. "We need to make sure it never comes back. We have to destroy it completely." Nodding in grim agreement, they gathered the scattered bones and dry, flammable materials from around the chamber. Working together, they piled everything atop Clawfoot Jack's body, creating a macabre pyre in the heart of the underground lair. Emmy found an old lantern, the oil inside still potent. He poured it over the pile, the liquid dark and thick. With a deep, steadying breath, Emmy struck a match. The flame flickered hesitantly for a moment before catching, the fire spreading quickly across the pyre. The light from the flames cast their shadows large and dancing on the walls, a grotesque ballet of those who had ventured too deep into the bowels of terror. As the fire consumed Clawfoot Jack's body, the chamber filled with a sickening smell, a final physical testament to the beast's evil. The heat from the flames was intense, forcing them to step back, but they watched unflinchingly, ensuring that every piece was reduced to ash. "Let's never forget what happened here," Sergiu said, his voice firm despite the tears that continued to stream down his face. "Let's never forget David." They left the chamber as the last of the flames died down, navigating the tunnels with a solemn determination. Their journey back to the surface was silent, each step away from the depths a step back into a world that would never be the same for them. Emerging into the cool night air of Somber Hollow, the moon was a thin crescent, its pale light insufficient to chase away the darkness that clung to their hearts. They walked back towards the village, their bodies exhausted, their souls heavy with the burden of survival. In the days that followed, their tale would be told in hushed tones, a story of bravery and loss that would become part of the lore of Somber Hollow.